every podcast ever, there has been a burst of podcasts all over the scenes. Everyone who has a mic and who doesn't have a mic can buy a mic and just speak relentlessly. And the podcast which I grew up listening to, it was something around the lines as if it has to be something meaningful. It was a replacement of radio. It is a show, and because it is a show, it's focused on something. For example, a true crime podcast. A true crime podcast is a genre in which people will come and they will recite and navigate the story of the crime which has happened, but in an interesting way, revealing the story, but in a way that you become curious and you take away something. And that was the genesis of the podcast. But right now, it just podcast has become something like I speak to you, and anything random. There is no point of the show. There is no theme of the show. It's just a podcast. And the word podcast has become synonymous like stand-up. Everybody is doing comedy work and putting it as a stand-up because it get more views. And therefore, if you just having a hangout and if you call it a podcast, it's not a podcast. Podcast is something which is geared towards something. It has a theme and it has a narrative. It has a time limit. It is a show, a proper show, and not something random. And you can think of it as Joe Rogan has been something random. He keeps on talking for 4 hours and you want to be Joe Rogan. But before you do that, become like Joe Rogan, like become a comedian, become a stand-up artist, become an MMA expert and a host and all sorts of things. And maybe then you have the personality of it, then you can do a podcast. I'm not sure, but there's been 2 podcasts and everything is similar. Hey, how are you doing? Hey, tell me about how from where you have been become popular. What is the story? Where you'll be in 5 years, 10 years? And most podcasts are of famous people who have something to promote, and there is no agenda, there is no show. It's just become a gimmick of promotions or an agenda driven to have brand deals and make lots of money, and everyone is happy. But you can call it anything, but it is not a podcast. Okay, it's just a business and it's not a show.